And Graham, could you take it away?
Certainly, Brian. Thank you very much indeed. So Graham Longley-Brown, I'll be kicking off. And Jim and I think it's almost certain to say will spectacularly fail to answer the question that Brian posed about how do we game all this stuff that Sean has just been talking about. But we will give you our best shot and fundamentally an update of what we have been doing as part of the program of work that Brian referred to. So I'm just going to share my screen. And can someone tell me that you've got Wargaming Influence in front of you, please?
We have.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. So the program of work that we've been just referred to is the one that Brian mentioned. It's the representation of behavioral effects, and that's a DSDL program of work. You can see on the left-hand side, Colin Marsden, who is the project lead and the initiator, and to be honest, our guiding light, and a huge hand of respect to Colin for taking this on. What Jim and I are part of is actually an influence wargaming project, and that plays in to this wider program of work. But all of the projects playing into it, you can see in the italics what we are trying to achieve, and that does talk directly to the question that Brian posed to us. I'm going to post that link into the chat in a few seconds, so you can see that. You don't have to note it now. But just there's one point I would make before I hand over to Jim, and that is the activities that are conducted. Ours has primarily, not exclusively, but primarily been a research project. So although Jim's going to talk to some of the things that we have been doing, the activities are primarily research. So what we're giving you is largely theory, which has to some extent been executed, but we have not been running around delivering influence wargame after influence wargame. So that's by way of context. Jim is now going to just talk quite quickly to what is different about Wargaming Influence. I'll then pick up and take you through the structure of the proposed handbook and go through some of the contents quite quickly. And then Jim at the end will tell you about some of the hands-on engagements and the activities that we've been doing. So on that note, Jim, over to you.
Thank you. Once again, Jim Wallman, the warm-up act for the main performance. But what I thought I'd do that's maybe helpful here is to bring out a few key points about the so what. And we've covered quite a lot already, Sean's work and others, about the differences. But one of the things that we in the project have been considering and looking at and relating to the various stakeholders is to explain and to understand what's different. So I'm explaining this through one of my obligatory spurious diagrams, and to explain the slide here, the green box are the things that I think are really important, and the yellow box is the things that are affected by all the things in the green box. It's a Venn diagram. I'm told they're very effective. Anyway, front and center at the top, one of the things we hit repeatedly is the issue of cognitive bias. And there's quite a bit of work going on into how we approach that. And it's been interesting to hear in this conference how this thread of cognition runs right through everything. And in particular, fascinating stuff about how language affects cognition. And in this area where we are dealing with unknowns, we're dealing with soft or qualitative effects, cognitive bias can be a real showstopper, or at very least negate the value of what you're doing. And related to that is, of course, where we're dealing with subjective work, where we're looking at effects where the causality is not always clear. I'm going to mention that in a minute. Opinions vary, and if you get three experts in a room, you'll get 4 opinions. It can be quite difficult to corral that into something that's operationalizable and made into a game. And participants matter far more. In a kinetic war game, the simulation of the combat is about if you fire this missile, it will have this effect. The person who presses the button is not so important. In this, the person who's pressing the influence button is very important. And getting the correct perspectives, or at very least understanding the breadth of perspectives, or understanding what you don't know, are very important. One of the things we found in conducting various experiments on influence wargaming is that you have to be extremely upfront about what you don't know. You have to caveat, if it's to be useful at all, you have to caveat heavily on what we've not included. And I'm particularly struck by conversations about the use of the involvement of indigenous groups. You know, if it's about us, it has to include us. This really is a theme which is diving straight into the influence field that we've been looking at. So within that larger picture of it's all about brains. There are other things which drill down in terms of how one operationalizes an influence war game. The effects are diffuse. You're never sure about causality. And one of the things that comes up around causality and attribution is that sometimes stuff happens. And in a war game, if you construct a war game where the things that happen are always the action of some other player, you've immediately removed an area of realism in your game, because in real life stuff happens and it may not be your adversary, it might be something completely unrelated. And filtering out an attribution is really, really important in terms of understanding what's going on. The effects in the games we've been looking at are primarily qualitative, and that really speaks to the importance of having in an analytical war game, having qualitative measures. And one of the consistent issues that crops up is where we are used to in the analytical world thinking quantitatively very largely, we're now very heavily indicated that the tools of social science, qualitative research, qualitative methods, and we're seeing this in the examples we've had in this conference, that qualitative analysis is also key. I think the final point I'll make on the so what is that time moves differently. Time is an illusion, in an influence game doubly so. The point here is that the things you try to do in the influence field can have an effect really quickly, or it can have an effect a year down the line. Because you're dealing across a wide spectrum of effects. You might be acting in the economic sphere, in the information sphere, in the media, education, cultural, and so on. And cause and effect can be separated by variable amounts of time. So one of the other things that we're recognizing is that a successful influence war game may have to cover a much longer period. And that's not just, oh, well, each turn's a year. It might be, and its indications it will be, that your games are over more game turns. So you may say, well, actually, instead of typically you might do 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 game turns in a conventional war game. What if you were running a war game which had 50 turns in it, or 100 turns? That changes the perspective, it changes the thinking, and so on. So time and the management of variable time, is this a variable bound, a variable length of game, and so on, is becoming quite a key factor. So there we are. That's so what about influence war games. Over to Graham.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much indeed. Before I go on, that's better. A caveat. Please note please note firstly that there is a updated version of Lost in Space. So all you youngsters out there hopefully will get that quote as much as all of us oldsters. However, the caveat, this is very much work in progress. A lot of you have been involved. Thank you very much indeed. But the handbook, and Brian actually alluded to this, it's not yet definite. It's prospective. We hope it's going to be published towards the back end of this year, but it is not yet certain. So this is absolutely work in progress. It is not a brief about a finished product. And for that reason, I'm afraid we cannot share the slides, although this is being recorded. So you will be able to refer back, because I am now going to dive in and talk quite a lot of detail at pace about the contents and the structure of this prospective work. So that's the outline of this work in progress. 5 chapters, very much like the original MOD Wargaming Handbook. And I'm going to go through each of those and just pull out some of the bullets. And you're going to see a series of slides build, which will look like this with quite a lot of detail in them. I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to pull out the key facts. It is, as mentioned, it is predicated on the MOD Wargaming Handbook. Now, we're not saying that that is best practice, but that is the UK's overarching doctrine. So 2 points on that. Firstly, there is a real risk that the answer that Brian said, how do we game this stuff, is just read the manual, but do it better. And although that is a valid answer, it cannot be the only answer. So in this handbook, we've got to produce substantive factors and considerations and guidance, which is different to the MOD Wargaming Handbook. But everything we say, to a large extent, is based on the Wargaming Handbook. Point number 2 is, in this prospective handbook, we are seeing it and being for 2 audiences. There is, as the Wargaming Handbook originally, there is the sponsor level. And those are the people we're looking at to read this document. But there's also going to be more in this at the practitioner level. So it will go down to a deeper level of depth than the original MOD Wargaming Handbook. Okay, don't be scared by the following slides. They get increasingly more complex, but here we go. Okay, so understanding the definition, and just look at the bits in bold. I'll take you around. I'm starting at bullet number 1, or box number 1. The definition is up there on the screen. One of the things that we have found when talking to practitioners, certainly in the military, is that a lot of people do not understand what influence is, the definition of influence. There's a horrifying statistic from one of our senior headquarters, I'm not going to tell you who they are, that just prior to a war game, 15% of the participants had actually read the doctrine on influence. So point number 1, do not assume that people understand what influence is. Point number 2, do assume that people do not understand what wargaming is. So you've got those 2 things. People do not understand influence. People do not understand wargaming. We're already on shaky ground. The point about that pink diagram at the top, that's just a collection of doctrine, is there's a new UK doctrine, the Integrated Operating Concept 2025, IOPSI 25, and you'll see on the right, protect, engage, constrain, and fight. Those are the contexts within which we could operate. So although we've just talked half an hour ago about everything short of fighting, and then actually the caveat that Jim put on that it does include fighting, we are predominantly looking at those protect, engage, constrain, i.e. pre-fighting. So that clearly is a very broad spectrum. I'm not going to talk to bullet 2, sorry, bubble 2, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And I'm not going to talk to bullet 3 because this is forming, and that's just where we're bringing things together. The point about bullet 4, the user landscape, is you can see on the left-hand side, this is huge. Our games, our influence games have got to, depending on the research question, obviously, or the training questions, go from horizon scanning on the left-hand side, right the way, which is looking obviously 20, 30, whatever it is, years out, right the way across to operating the force. So operating the force could be, let's say, a course of action war game in a tent with about 12 guys in Mali with no reach back facility or anything. So there is an incredibly broad scope. It's got to cover strategic right the way through to tactical, as well as those protect, engage, constrain, and fight. And if you look at the bottom of that diagram at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that tiny little word people. So that word is quite important. We are not just talking analytical games, we are talking educational and training games. So influence war games could, in theory or in prospect, be covering a very broad scope. That's what I'm going to say to this slide. Just notice bottom left, bubble number 5, emerging points. These are not exhaustive. They are not complete. They're just points that I wanted to bring out for the sake of today. And it's just those ones in bold. So what we're trying to do with the handbook is force the reader to accept a new perspective on wargaming. And that's quite a significant task. And I've talked to that points 3 and 4 already. Okay, these slides get increasingly scary. So chapter 2, designing and delivering influence wargames. The intro is based on the MED Wargaming Handbook. I've mentioned that. But the design factors at the top and the parameters, just look at the first few in bold, although all of them are important. For example, you'll see timescales that Jim has just talked to. And we know this, don't we? The purpose is absolutely paramount. If you now scan bottom left to bubble number 7, you will see that those golden threads, and that's a term that Rex introduced at, I first heard at Connections UK 2017-18, I don't know, but those golden threads designed to a purpose. So it is absolutely imperative, and this is the first of many examples of it's just best practice, now just do it better. So I'm going to stop saying that phrase, but getting the purpose right is critical, and I'll come back to that. The training versus analysis context, you must understand where you are in terms of, is it one or other of those, although those dual benefits, we all know this. The level of discovery, where are you in there's a spectrum, left-hand side, just a simple understanding of a situation, moving along the spectrum to developing insights, and then at the far end of the spectrum, where you are validating or evaluating a forming or a formed plan. Where you are on that level of discovery, level of experimentation is critical, and you have to know that. Supporting versus supported, we're talking about an influence war game supporting a wider war game, think a conventional game, but with an influence input, as opposed to supported, where the influence game is the primary activity. And then I'm not going to go through all of them, but audiences, actors, adversaries, and enemies, please just note the abbreviation A3E. That is what a lot of this is about. So the point is there are a lot of considerations and parameters, and you have to know where you are in the context before you go on. Right, bullet number 3. Countering cognitive biases. I literally earlier on today deleted that because one of my colleagues said, actually, we cannot explain how to counter cognitive biases in this book. There are many, many tomes to do that. What we have to do is acknowledge and recognize that there are countering biases. But if you now scan to bottom left, number 7 again, you'll see that the second bullet is when you deliver these games, you must counter. So in this book, we're going to explain where cognitive biases can feature in the wargaming process. When you deliver the games, you must counter cognitive biases. And that is why just above that, in the golden threads, you will see that we've added, or we're suggesting we add, red teaming / critical thinking. I'm not going to go into that distinction, which becomes a golden thread as well as designed to a purpose and robust analysis. And that runs right the way through the wargaming life cycle from initiation through to refinement. So that is another golden thread. Countering cognitive biases. We've just heard Jim talk to it. Everyone's talking to it. It is critical. Bubble number 4 then, what's different? So picking up from what Jim has just said, and again, this is what we should be doing, but we have now to do it very, very well. So in fact, just earlier on in the previous presentation, I think David Connell and Patrick were talking in the chat to the sponsor responsibilities. It's not just during initiation, which is where the sponsor has to get that aim clear and bound the scope, but right the way through, and this is a practical lesson we have learned, is if you have the sponsor engaged from the get-go all the way through, you're on a path to success. If the sponsor is not engaged at any stage, you are likely to fail. So that is a very nice to have in conventional war games. It is essential where we are now. I've talked to the aim and the bounded scope because, bounded scope, we know that influence actually is everything, potentially. So you cannot wargame everything. We have to bound the scope. The point about integration, that is integration with things other than wargaming. So think Peter Perler's cycle of research or an integrated analysis and experimentation campaign plan, because wargaming will not give you the answer. It will generate questions which have to be analysed or picked up in a training progression, whatever it may be, elsewhere. Bullet 4 is very important, we think. You have to have multiple complementary analytical approaches. And that also, you could extrapolate that in terms of game approaches as well, and having multiple techniques, multiple views on the mechanisms, we think is really, really important. Confidence levels. We've got to try and assign confidence levels, and it can be done. And chapter 4 in a minute, I'm going to talk to that, but it's essential that we assign those. The scenario, again, this is obvious. If we're in protect, engage, and the rest of it, we are probably wargaming prior to conflict. Now, that's a blinding glimpse of the obvious to you guys. You put that to most military folk who are comfortable with war and with combat, and they will expect a war game to be in the conflict somewhere. We are almost certainly positioned before open hostilities. The battle space isn't a battle space, and again, we all know this, but the point here is the message is to military guys. Military folk love pushing counters, showing battle groups, brigades, ships, planes around a map. That is almost certainly inappropriate, because the battle space, as we all know, is abstracted. It's the classic battle for the narrative. So your visualization is probably not going to be geographical. Obvious to us, but that's a hurdle that military folk need to get over. Same applies to bullet 8. And then you guys have just been talking to it, the expert, and absolutely diverse participation. That is so important. And that was the point. And I noted what Benjamin said about crossed views of common issues from the last presentation. Absolutely spot on. So diversity is critical. Novel structures, we're going to talk to that later. And then just now, bullet 11, there are very few methods, models, and tools. And I'm going to come to this in a minute, but that is beyond simulation. So very few of these things exist. Enough said. Bullet number 5, deliberately, I'm hoping you're not really seeing the detail there, because that is a diagram that Jim is developing. The point I want to get across is that we now, in this handbook, and we as a community, need to grasp a couple of really prickly thistles, and that is the myth that there is one size fits all game. Just from the scope that we all know, it is clear to us that there is no one size fits all. That is not the case with a lot of military guys who see a type of war game initially and think that that's it, and that hammer will sort out all their problems. So that's one thing we got to do. And then, and that is what that diagram, we are grasping the nettle. So the diagram is just going to start explaining the different formats of war games, because we've all seen lots and lots of them. We're now grasping the nettle. And the next one then is the point about definitions. And again, we've just got to make it absolutely clear. Otherwise, we will be talking at cross purposes. We know this as a community. We do it all the time. Now we've actually got to do it. And the point about in the previous presentation, you know, qu'est-ce qu'un matrix game? I don't know. How do you say matrix game in French? Well, there is no answer to that. So why do we use the term? Whatever it is, we've got to grasp it. Development and play testing then, this is obvious, you guys will all know this, but those iterative play tests with the sponsor, generally in conventional games, it's too often the case, the sponsor will outsource the game. That no longer can be the case. The sponsor, must be absolutely involved and go through a very rigorous, quite frequent engagement in terms of play testing. And then emerging points, I think I've covered the first one, red teaming, critical thinking, that is a golden thread, countering cognitive biases. Okay, so the third up from the bottom, influenced wargaming is new. We've been doing conventional gaming for 200 years, whatever, since 1824. This is brand spanking new. We've been doing influenced wargaming for about 5 minutes. So it is really important that all of us, the community and the sponsors, capture all the lessons identified and share them so that we can move forward. And that is even more clearly important than conventional games. And then the bottom bullet, just snuck away bottom left, classification is not an issue. Talking things like cyber capabilities or whatever it may be, a lot of people frown and say, well, we can't game that, that's above secret. Rubbish. It can be done. There are just ways that we need to think about, whether you have a compartmentalized series of games or you just have a breakout room, whatever it may be, there are ways to game everything. For example, think about the effect that is being delivered, not the classified capability. So classification is not an issue. Executing war games. I'm only going to talk to the introduction and then the adjudication, because adjudication is scary, and I'm talking about the subject and the slide. Firstly, in this chapter, executing, we're covering the validate and refine steps as well, but adjudication is just so critical. The next slide will shock you. Don't try and take in all the detail. Come back to the recording. I'm just going to pull out a couple of points. So the first one is, it's hard. And this, how do you adjudicate the outcome of player decisions? We've got to accept it is hard, but it is absolutely at the center of influence war games. So the point at the top there, the human in the loop, HWA is hand-waving adjudication. And that is what is currently prevalent, be it seminar games, matrix games, whatever it may be. That is the prevalent method of adjudication. And I'm not saying for a second that that is wrong. I'm just saying that it is prevalent. But we've got to support adjudicators, and we've got to move beyond what is just hand-waving adjudication. I'm not going to go into the detail, except just note under the bullet, under bubble 2, you can affect either in-game tracks, or you can affect real players, which is what Sean was just talking to just now. So that's just a point to note. I'm not going to go through the forming various adjudication approaches. I won't talk to those. And I'm not going to talk through bubbles 3, 4, 5, but just scan them. I'm sure you are already, but just register all those challenges. There are a plethora of them. Calibration, the point in bold, calibration is where you start tracks and so on and so forth. Brian spoke to prestige. Where do you start a prestige track? What in-game effects will move that track? In what direction and how much? That is calibration. It's hard. Just look at the risks for a second. That is just one from a table of about 12. We've got specific to adjudication, and there are about 30 overall. Some people will say the risks of wargaming influence are too great. If you get those impacts coming to pass, there is a risk of strategic miscalculation, and therefore the people will say we should not do it. That is just not viable. We are doing it, we have to do it, ergo we have to manage the risks, but we have to accept that the risks are significant. The essential characteristics, I'm not going to go through them. You can scan it now. You can come back and have a look at the recording. And practical recommendations on the left. I've made that bold because at the end of each section or chapter, we're not sure yet, we will just have a whole series of, these are things you might consider. And to be honest, a lot of the ones you can see there came from interviews that we conducted with Brian and with Rex, funny old thing, with Tom Mowat, the list goes on. So we're going to have lists of practical recommendations, which are absolutely those practitioner level things I mentioned. Okay, so that's adjudication, it's scary. And that's only that second bubble when we come to executing. I'm not going to talk to facilitation, other than to note, if you look on the left-hand side, bubble 7, the pillars, and these are, again, Rex Brynan came up with these. Originally, the golden threads I've mentioned, there was a pillar as well, which was facilitation. I would suggest that we're now adding adjudication as a standalone thing. There is a pillar of effective execution. If we don't get that wrong, we will fail. So facilitation, this is now just do it well. And it is as simple as that. If you get a poor facilitator in an influence war game, the risks will come to pass. There's that virtuous triangle with the facilitator working to the game controller and lead analyst, controlling those things. Facilitation is crucial. I am not going to talk to bubble 4, data capture and analysis. Analysis is a golden thread that runs right the way through it. There's just some of the bullets. There are books written on this, so some of the bullets there you can just have a quick look at, but just notice the top one, continuing critical thinking all the way through. The after action review, the AAR. This is drawing on our own experiences, and also Stephen Downes Martin has written some very good stuff about this. The things that we found to be really, really important, brackets essential, and very rarely happen now, is that immediate post-game consolidation. And that is of the narrative, of the outcomes, of the reasons, of the rationales for player decisions, the branch points where things could have gone differently. That is at least half a day, if not a full day. And that is just making sure that we have understood what the war game has delivered. And to be honest, that's whether the actual war game is a day long or a week long. You need to devote serious resource to that. And then the second bullet, do the same thing again for the actual game processes. And Stephen will say that that needs another 6 hours. So serious resource needed for the after action review. I'm not going to go into bubble 6, but what I will do, if you look at the bottom in bold, recreational gamers, you'll be aware of the phrase legacy games, think pandemic. And when we're not using that term, for us, it's more of a campaign or iterative games. It doesn't have to be marching forward. You can pop back and do something again, but learning all these lessons, both for the games themselves and the outcomes, is critical. Okay, building confidence. So again, very, very quickly, I'm conscious of time. Verification validation, our book is not going to say how to do that. That is covered elsewhere. Top right, the point here is that V&V is part of establishing confidence levels. And our book is going to say that we have to at least make a stab of establishing confidence levels. You can see in the UK, the levels of validation there. And the point about bubble 3, some of these methodologies are available. So if people turn around and go, well, how do you do that? You can't do it. Yes, you can. There are methodologies already available to do that. And the point is we have to do it. Just note the distinction above bubble 4 there. You've got two things that we need to apply confidence levels to. One is the outputs of the game, think AAR, and then the other is actually the game itself, the method, models, and tools. So we need to differentiate between those two things. Obviously, for the game, the outputs are the most important thing. I'm not going to go through bubble 4. That's just some examples. I'm not going to go through bubble 5. And practical recommendations, again, when the book comes out, there will just be a list of those sort of things. But where I'm going to finish on this one, number 7, emerging points, anything can be assessed for levels of confidence. That is not to say that we will get those levels of confidence correct, but it is better to have tried and to have thought about it and to have given a genuine, we have this degree of confidence in whatever it is. So the point is we have to try, and it is possible to do that. Final chapter, you'll be glad to know. So this chapter 5, we thought originally it was just going to be called modeling and simulation, but that is wrong. You'll see on the top left, it is not just M&S, which includes, AI, machine learning, agent-based modeling, and the rest of it. It's everything, and that absolutely includes human in the loops, or what some people refer to as human simulation. So it is not just M&S. Bubble 2, you can just scan that list. Those are, again, examples. It's not exhaustive. But note, please, bubble 3, when using any of these methods, models, tools, but especially simulations, i.e. computational simulations, we have to accept that there are risks, challenges, and cautions. And you can see a list there. Again, it is not exhaustive. And then the point about bubble 4, there will be guidance. There will be a table comparing some of the tools that you can use, and you can see that they're going to be scored against those bubbles 2 and 3. And emerging points, again, they reiterate, I don't think there's anything new there. So that is the structure of the book. We need your help. We have to get the first draft finished by the 31st of March. It will then go out to the community for review, note third bullet, and that will include UK MOD, and it goes out as a study draft. We're expecting then sometime around the summer to get those comments back and provide a second draft, and then we're hoping for publication towards the back end of the year. But we need those 3 bullets, really important. Cognitive bias has been mentioned. We are struggling to find examples of cognitive bias in influence war games because we've only been doing them 5 minutes. So if you can please give us those examples, that would be really, really useful. If there's things that from what I've just skimmed over, you think have to be in the book, please get in touch, but tell us why it's important. We've got to have the first draft done by 31st of March. We are a few weeks away. that please chip in if you think there's fundamental that we are missing what I've just gone through. And then reviewers, some of you are already engaged, but if any of you think that you are qualified and have the time to be a reviewer, then again, please get in touch. We cannot promise that we will be allowed to send it to everybody, but please let us know if you are interested. Right, I've talked for far too long. That, I think, is me. I'm now going to hand over to Jim to tell you about some of the stuff that we have done.
Thank you. Yeah, as you can see, that this is a labour of, I was going to say a labour of love, but I think love's putting it a bit too strong. Certainly it's a labour. We've been in this project and in part of this development, we've been doing some things, and these have been by way of lab experiments, which we've run through various play tests, just to explore ideas of what we can and might do. And we've done some, as it were, live fire work as well. So I'm just going to run through very, very quickly with a few bullets, some key things that we did. One approach we took, which we experimented with, was this one with influence mapping. And teams were given a fixed menu of options based on their capabilities. There was a not fully revealed influence network of key actors acting on particular issues that were covered in the game. So teams would interrogate the influence network to discover who influenced what, and then would attempt to either directly influence the actor or to attempt to do something with the levers or relationships they have with other actors. And so that was kind of an interesting experiment in understanding the influence networks within a government, who mattered, who didn't matter. And in fact, one of the insights gained from this, which shouldn't be a surprise, was that developing the networks themselves before one even started playing the game. And we did, this is a fictional example, although for many of us, Ruritania is chillingly real. We also did it with real world countries, and so the insights gained by developing the networks and actually drawing these diagrams before you even played the game was had tremendous kind of research and insight value. So next slide.
I'm trying.
It's all right.
Sorry.
There you go. No worries. So the other approach was taking again a kind of fictional high north, not quite high north, but northern Barents Sea crisis game as our setting, and this started off using a matrix type games methodology. That proved in the early attempts not really to be quite what we wanted, and so we looked at building that into a structured interrogation into players' actions and intentions, so that the game explored not just what you could do, but why you're doing it, and to use it as an analytical tool for looking at what became important and what influenced both within the game structure, but in what it was trying to represent, what influenced actions and where people went. Once again, we provided players, this wasn't a completely make it up as you go along. We provided players with a menu of capabilities. And one of the things that came out of that was also limits placed on the use of capabilities, and in particular, the level of availability. And one of the things about this was set at a kind of operational level. One of the things that comes out of that is, of course, not all assets that are used across the broad spectrum of influence are available at the operational level. And so there was a sub-game about influencing higher levels of command or even home governments in order to convince them that the national asset you wanted to use was available to you in the game. Next slide, please. And then we looked at another game called The Village, which was a look at multiplayer behaviors, in many ways a smaller version of sort of stuff Sean was looking at. But in this case, particularly interested in the hypothesis that you need players to play influence, and I think there's a place for that. And so this looked at the social dynamic in a small community, and that was the context was a humanitarian intervention, and what it generated was some interesting interactions, and we looked at different factions within a village, and then how an external actor, in this case the UN, attempting to bring peace to an English village, how cultural differences can be brought into trying to represent influence, how one might interact with or exploit or leverage in some way already existing internal social structures. So it's a kind of social structure model which generated some interesting stuff. Of course, the big parts in all of this were the difficulty of representing appropriately cultural factors, and this is where we go right back to cognitive bias and diversity, etc., in terms of representing this sort of thing. Next slide, please. Finally, a game called A Line in the Sand. This was for a serious purpose. This wasn't experimental. This was delivered and was to look at how the political influence within a particular region operated. And the key, there was a lot of interest in how particular political actors were able to act in a region, how their political capital moved, and so that was the key focus of the game. And whilst there was a kinetic dimension to it, it was very much sidelined. And the things that we were interested in, I'm using in this slide not the examples from the game. We were very interested. This was a manual game for a number of reasons. We couldn't digitize it. And so we were doing things like recording the outcomes of negotiation, notoriously difficult in games to get people to note down what they did. But we recorded negotiations, and we were able to do a lot of really good data capture, which generated some really interesting outputs for the end user. And one of the things that we looked at, we also used, to go back to the adjudication, was a influence diagram adjudication tool, which is the thing with all the lines on it at the bottom. Again, not enough time to talk into that in great detail, but it was useful to have a tool which was transparent and clear as to how it worked, for the participants to have confidence that when we were adjudicating various outcomes, that they had at least some had the minimum credibility necessary for the project. And so this particular game was also a demonstrator of how, in this case, we worked extremely closely with the end user at all stages from inception to delivery, and that generated what I think we can generally say was a very successful outcome. But it highlighted that we couldn't have done it by taking a brief, going away, designing a game, and coming back. That simply wouldn't have worked. That's me. Thank you very much.